Hi everyone, welcome back to class. And again, I'm pre-recording this just in case I'm totally out of it post-vaccine. But again, here's our back to our lecture. Okay, so what we have is hematocrit, and with hematocrit, remember that hematocrit for our class and most institutions is the percent volume of red blood cells in a whole blood sample. So what we have here are two test tubes, and if you might remember the stats from earlier, so again, the normal range according to the NIH is for females is 36.1 to 44.3%. But for males, it's slightly higher. I'm showing the range here. So the average range is about, the normal range for males is a little higher, 40.7 to 50.3%. Now, some of you observant students are like, wait, why is there a difference between the sexes? And it all boils down to this, or actually the main reason why is this. Why do men have a generally higher hematocrit on average? And it's all due to this. And ooh, it's a hormone. And what type of hormone? Yeah, it's a steroid hormone, right? So there's another hormone. Now that was a steroid hormone, that was testosterone. There's another hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO for short. Now they're not the same thing. That wasn't your EPO I showed earlier. So EPO looks like this, and it's a glycoprotein hormone. That means it started out as a polypeptide, then you added sugars to it to make it glycoprotein. But at its very base, it is a peptide. And that's why we see with this ribbon structure over here. So what is EPO? So EPO triggers new red blood cell production. So it generates, when you release EPO into your body generates more red blood cells. And the organ that produces EPO are the kidneys. And so what happens in that previous example, so why do men have generally higher hematocrit? Well, we have all the androgens and testosterones from men, and the androgen levels are higher in men on average. So androgens stimulate the kidneys to produce EPO. So the more androgens you have, the more it stimulates your kidney to produce more EPO. And that's why, in general, men have higher hematocrit. More androgens means more EPO, means more red blood cells. So again, the other thing is that hypoxia also stimulates EPO, and that's a new vocab word. So in general, hypoxia is not the same as hypoxemia, which we'll cover probably in either, if not this unit, the next unit. But hypoxia in general is when your blood or your tissues don't have enough oxygen. Now, this is different from O2 sat and hypoxemia, which is a related but different term. But basically, hypoxia, you don't have enough oxygen in your tissues. Normoxia is normal O2 levels normally found in the atmosphere. It gets a little complicated with the terminology, but just know normoxia, you have enough oxygen. Hypoxia, this is not getting enough oxygen. It's a very general term. But the thing is that what happens if your tissues don't have enough oxygen? Well, the thing is that your kidneys, they're more than just things that organs that take blood and filter into urine. They're also very sensitive to the chemical composition of your blood. So say the blood that reaches your kidneys or your kidneys themselves become hypoxic and they start having low levels of oxygen. So what your kidneys do in response is that they crank up the EPO production, and then they send out EPO into your bloodstream, then it reaches your bone marrow, and your bone marrow produces all these new red blood cells. And what do red blood cells carry? They carry a lot of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen, right? So if you have more red blood cells due to that burst of increased amount of EPO production, that increased amount of red blood cells are going to deliver more oxygen and carry more oxygen to your tissues, thus restoring homeostasis. And this is the overall process of how you generate more red blood cells. So EPO, so erythropoietin, stimulates the erythrocyte production. And the process of producing erythrocyte production is erythropoiesis. So even though it's very similarly spelled, poietin is the hormone, poiesis is the process. So erythropoietin stimulates the process of erythropoiesis. Again, only a few letters change, but they take it, EPO is produced by the kidneys, but erythropoietin stimulates the bone marrow to do erythropoiesis, the process. So red blood cells are not made in the kidney. They're actually made at a different site, the red bone marrow. So the thing again, remember that your red blood cells are full of that protein we call hemoglobin, and hemoglobin contains those heme molecules that bind to oxygen. Therefore, if your kidneys crank out a lot of erythropoietin, that erythropoietin will reach the bone marrow, and the bone marrow will produce more red blood cells via erythropoiesis. So when you get more red blood cells, that means more hemoglobin, more ability to carry oxygen. Therefore, you have more oxygen in your blood overall. Okay, so where is this place? Where is the United States Olympic Training Center? It's in Colorado Springs, and the elevation at Colorado Springs is, yeah, 6,035 feet. That's over a mile altitude. Now, what happens when you go higher and higher up in altitude? What happens to the air? It gets thinner, right? So the thing is that why? Because there's less pressure, therefore there are fewer molecules. So the oxygen concentration here in Honolulu at sea level is around 20.9%. Now, at that altitude in Colorado Springs, that's only like because you have less pressure in the air, you have fewer oxygen molecules in the air. Therefore, the actual, when you taking the same volume of breath at sea level versus in Colorado Springs, you're actually getting less percentage of of oxygen or fewer oxygen molecules with every breath. So in other words, this is what the concept behind altitude training. So with altitude training, what's the whole concept? Well, the thing is that, again, air pressure is lower at high altitudes. So lower air pressure means you get fewer oxygen molecules with each breath. So what that does is like, okay, your kidneys are going to sense you have lower oxygen. So your kidneys are going to produce more EPO. When you have more EPO, well, that triggers red blood cell production in your bone marrow. And when you have more red blood cells, you have increased carrying capacity for oxygen. So, would that be useful for sports? Yeah, that would definitely be useful for sports, especially the sports that require a lot of energy expenditure and aerobic capacity. So this is why it's often favored in endurance sports, and that's why this is kind of like with altitude training. The whole theory behind it is that, okay, if we have our athletes training at high altitudes, they're going to build up natural EPO, they're going to build up their red blood cells, and then if they have competition at sea level, they're going to have more oxygen carrying capacity than people who train at sea level the whole time. So it's like natural doping. That's, whether it's unfair or not, I leave it to people who debate that stuff. But it's a interesting way of just using, without requiring like artificial injections of EPO, that you can increase your natural EPO by doing altitude training. But this is what getting to is like, this is often why EPO is very attractive as a performance enhancing drug in sports. And I think a lot of you freshmen were like kids when this happened, but this was a Lance Armstrong, and he's still alive, but you probably haven't heard from him now. Why? Well, if you ask and maybe you were aware as a kid, but especially back a decade ago, he was like a rock star. Why? Because he won the Tour de France 7 times. And like, so there used to be like American flag when he was competing, there were American flags everywhere. Everyone knew him. He was like he was like a A-list celebrity. But then they found out that he was taking EPO among many other things. I think he was also taking testosterone, and the crazy thing is like he had this crazy elaborate system where he had like lookouts, he had a doctor working with him, and also like blood doping where he would have clean blood and then infuse it back. It was like this complicated, really sophisticated system, and it was amazing he got away with it for so long. But it all came crashing down. And if you look at the winners of the Tour de France, there's a big gap. And that big gap is where he did win, but they just struck him from the record. And yeah, so, but the thing is, like, I remember, I forgot what was in his book, because I did read this book before the whole scandal. And I think he said, like, Or someone else said that like all those guys in the peloton and the Tour de France, like almost all of them dope to some extent. And yeah, especially since you're cycling around a freaking whole country and going up the Alps, up and down all these hills, it makes sense that you would want to dope with it. Like, or it makes sense that having extra EPO and having extra oxygen capacity would provide an advantage. And this guy right here, so you don't have to read French, but what they call him is Mr. 60%. So they're calling him Mr. 60% in reference to his taux de hematocrit, which is basically his hematocrit level. So his hematocrit level was 60%. And is that normal? Go back to my previous slides and you'll be like, kind of sus, right? And other endurance sports where you're expending a lot of energy, breathing a lot, and needing a lot of oxygen. Well, you also find that EPO is commonly used in other sports like MMA. Like this seems to be pretty common, but again, if these guys are like throwing all their punches and like all these grappling and they're using like pretty much all their muscles in their body. So it kind of makes sense that if you have increased oxygen capacity, that would provide an advantage. So yeah, EPO, this is why EPO is always tested for in sports because again, it potentially provides a huge advantage.